Stephen A. Smith Show. Before I get on out of here, I had to talk about a story that's very, very important. And albeit indirectly, it involves...
Sometimes the biggest shifts don't happen on the court. They happen when someone finally says what everyone else has been dancing around. This week, Stephen A. Smith did exactly that, and the WNBA is not going to like the fallout. For nearly 2 years, there's been a low hum around one name, whispers about resentment, side eyes, awkward moments nobody wanted to explain on camera. People felt it, fans saw it, but nobody with a big microphone wanted to connect the dots. Until now. Because this isn't just about basketball anymore. According to Stephen A., what we're watching is the collision between a league and a force it no longer fully controls. A rookie who didn't just arrive, she detonated expectations. And when the system tried to slow her down, corporate America did the opposite. That rookie is Caitlin Clark. This week's news involving Nike didn't just elevate her brand. It quietly exposed how wide the gap has become between her and the rest of the league. Not in talent debates, not in fan arguments, in cold, uncomfortable reality. Stephen A. isn't arguing that Clark is good. He's arguing that she's an economy. And when one player becomes more valuable than the ecosystem around her, everything changes. Power dynamics shift, tensions surface, and the things people were once afraid to say start coming out anyway. Because once money, influence, and culture line up behind one athlete, pretending everything is just basketball becomes impossible. And the moment that confirmed all of this didn't happen during a game. The moment that changed everything didn't come with a press conference or a league announcement. It came during Christmas Day programming, when most people weren't expecting a statement, let alone a power move. That's when Nike dropped the From Anywhere commercial. On the surface, it looked like a standard hype ad. Cinematic shots, clean visuals, confident tone. But if you paid attention to the details, it became obvious this wasn't just marketing, it was positioning. Because Nike made a very deliberate choice about who appeared alongside Caitlin Clark and who didn't. There were no WNBA legends, no current stars from the league, no pay your dues symbolism. Instead, Nike surrounded her with global cultural figures, Travis Scott, the Jason Kelce and Travis Kelce brothers, people whose relevance exists far outside basketball. That wasn't accidental. Nike wasn't introducing Caitlin Clark to the WNBA audience. They were introducing her to the world. And that distinction is where the tension begins. By skipping over the league ecosystem entirely, Nike sent a message without ever saying it out loud. This wasn't about elevating women's basketball collectively. This was about elevating one athlete as a crossover icon, someone who doesn't need league validation to matter. According to Stephen A. Smith, this is the nightmare scenario for the WNBA's old guard. The idea that a rookie didn't just rise fast, she bypassed the line entirely. No waiting period, no gradual ascent, just instant placement at the top of the cultural food chain. And here's the part that stings the most. Nike didn't do this because they felt generous. They did it because the data told them to. Ratings, ticket demand, jersey sales, social engagement, everything pointed in one direction. Clark wasn't just the most popular player, she was the most profitable. So while the league was still talking about balance and parity, Nike made a business decision rooted in reality. They treated Caitlin Clark like a once-in-a-generation asset, not a rookie who needed to blend in. And once that commercial aired, there was no walking it back. Because when a brand like Nike makes that kind of investment, it doesn't just raise expectations, it redraws the hierarchy. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether Caitlin Clark belonged at the top. It was whether the league was ready to accept that she was already there. What made that Nike moment so jarring wasn't just the scale, It was the contrast. For months, the WNBA had been pushing a very specific message. This is a league built on balance, on shared visibility, on the idea that no single player should tower too far above the rest. Parity wasn't just a competitive goal, it was a marketing philosophy. And then Nike blew right through it. Because while the league was carefully spreading attention across rosters and storylines, Nike made a cold, data-driven decision. They didn't bet on the system, they bet on the outlier. According to Stephen A. Smith, that's where the disconnect started turning into friction. The WNBA wanted Caitlin Clark to be a star within the league. Nike treated her like a star above it. Those are two very different realities. From the league's perspective, promoting one player too aggressively risks alienating veterans, players who built the foundation when resources were scarce and visibility was limited. There's history there, pride, sacrifice, and asking that group to suddenly accept a rookie being fast-tracked to global icon status was always going to be delicate. Nike didn't care about delicate. They cared about reach, about crossover appeal, about who could pull in fans who had never watched a single quarter of women's basketball, and the numbers made the decision easy. Caitlin Clark wasn't just bringing in WNBA fans, she was bringing in NBA fans, NFL fans, college basketball fans, and people who didn't normally watch sports at all. That kind of gravity changes everything. It creates an uncomfortable truth. The league benefits from her presence, but it can't fully control it. And once that realization sets in, tension is inevitable. Because when a player becomes bigger than the platform starts feeling replaceable. Stephen A. has been blunt about this part. He argues that the league tried to slow the moment down, to manage feelings, to avoid backlash, to keep the peace. But in doing so, they underestimated how fast corporate America moves when it smells opportunity. Nike didn't wait for approval. They didn't ask for alignment. They acted. And now the league is stuck reacting instead of leading. That's why this moment feels so destabilizing. Not because Caitlin Clark succeeded, but because she succeeded on a timeline the WNBA didn't set. And once you lose control of the timeline, you lose control of the narrative. Which is exactly where the jealousy conversation stops being hypothetical and starts becoming unavoidable. This is where the conversation stops being emotional and starts being mathematical. Because once the numbers came out, everything else made sense. When early reports surfaced about Caitlin Clark signing an 8-year deal reportedly worth around $28 million, that alone was enough to send shockwaves through the WNBA. For context, that figure already dwarfed what most players would earn across their entire careers. But according to Stephen A. Smith, that number was never the real story. Reports and projections coming out of industry circles suggest that Clark's signature shoe line could realistically generate north of $100 million, with some estimates pushing closer to $150 million within its first few years. And that's just footwear, not apparel, not endorsements, not media appearances, just shoes. Now put that next to the average WNBA salary, which hovers around the mid-5 figures. Even max contracts don't come close. The gap isn't just wide, it's disorienting. And this is the point Stephen A. keeps hammering home. You cannot introduce that kind of wealth disparity into a competitive locker room and expect it to sit quietly. Human nature doesn't work that way, especially in a league built on shared struggle and collective advancement. For veteran players who spent years flying commercial, playing in half-filled arenas, and fighting for basic visibility, the optics are brutal. They helped build the house. And now, a rookie walks in with a penthouse view before the paint is even dry. That doesn't mean the resentment is justified, but it does make it predictable. Stephen A. argues that this is the real fuel behind the hard fouls, the cold shoulders, and the uncomfortable moments fans noticed last season. Not hatred, not rivalry, but displacement. The feeling of being leapfrogged by someone who represents a future you were promised but never got to fully enjoy. And when money enters the equation, everything intensifies. Because money isn't just about wealth, it's about value. It's about who the market decides matters most. And once that verdict is delivered, no amount of team-first messaging can unring that bell. That's why Stephen A. insists the jealousy narrative isn't speculation, it's inevitability. When one player generates more revenue than entire rosters combined, the league stops being a collective. It becomes an orbit. And Caitlin Clark is now the gravity at the center of it. Which explains why the next part of this story didn't stay theoretical for long. It started showing up on the court in ways nobody wanted to officially acknowledge. This is the part of the conversation people get uncomfortable with, because it moves from theory to pattern. Once Caitlin Clark actually stepped onto a WNBA floor, the tension didn't stay abstract. Fans started noticing things that were hard to ignore. Extra contact, hard checks that felt personal, moments where the whistle stayed quiet when it probably shouldn't have. And according to Stephen A. Smith, none of that was random. He's been clear about this. When resentment builds, it doesn't always come out in words. It comes out in behavior, in how aggressively someone is defended, in how often they're put on the floor, in how willing opponents are to send a message early in games. Stephen A. points back to several high-profile moments that fueled the conversation, the physical plays that went viral, the games where Clark appeared to be targeted, the nights where it felt like she was being tested not just as a player, but as a presence. Now, to be fair, basketball is a physical sport. Contact happens, rivalries form, and none of this proves intent on its own. But what Smith argues is that context matters. When these moments consistently happen to one player, the same player driving ratings, headlines, and money, it stops feeling coincidental. This is where the jealousy narrative becomes unavoidable. Because Clark isn't just another rookie trying to find her footing, she's the face of a financial shift. And when players feel like the spotlight has skipped over them permanently, some respond by trying to knock the spotlight down. Smith has been blunt about the psychology behind it. Guarding someone who is already worth exponentially more than you messes with your head. It changes how you compete. Some players rise to it, others take it personally. And that's why he warned that things could escalate. What fans saw last season, according to Smith, wasn't the peak, it was the preview. The league was still adjusting. The money wasn't fully realized yet. The shoe hadn't dropped, literally. Now that Clark is officially backed by Nike as a centerpiece asset, the dynamic shifts again. Because she's no longer just a rising star, she's an investment. And once that happens, everything changes, from how opponents play her, to how referees officiate her, to how the league itself responds when things get out of hand. Which sets the stage for the next uncomfortable question. If Caitlin Clark is now too valuable to ignore, what happens when the league has to decide whether to protect her? This is where the situation stops being just uncomfortable and starts becoming unavoidable. Because once a player reaches the level Caitlin Clark is now operating at, the league doesn't get the final say anymore. Corporate partners do. According to Stephen A. Smith, this is the point where the balance of power quietly shifts. When a company like Nike puts 9 figures on the table, not hypothetically, but in real projected revenue, they aren't just sponsoring an athlete, they're protecting an asset. And assets don't get treated like everyone else. This is where reports and speculation start circulating, and it's important to frame them correctly. Some analysts believe that the league may feel increased pressure to ensure Clark is protected on the floor, not because of favoritism, but because the financial stakes have changed. When hundreds of millions are tied to one player's health, optics suddenly matter a lot more. Stephen A. has hinted at this exact scenario. He suggested that next season could look very different in terms of officiating, tighter whistles, less tolerance for excessive contact, not because the league wants to crown a superstar, but because it can't afford to let one get damaged. And that's where the resentment risk explodes. Because the moment other players sense that one athlete is being shielded, the narrative flips. What used to be she's getting targeted becomes she's getting special treatment. And that perception, whether fair or not, is gasoline on an already smoldering fire. The league is trapped in a lose-lose scenario. If they don't intervene, they risk their biggest draw getting worn down. If they do intervene, they risk confirming every jealousy accusation floating around locker rooms. Stephen A. frames this as the inevitable consequence of delayed recognition. The WNBA wanted to manage Clark's rise carefully. Nike forced it forward, and now the league has to react in real time under a microscope. What makes this even more volatile is Clark's crossover appeal. She's no longer just accountable to basketball fans. She's tied to pop culture, music, and the NFL audience. If something ugly happens to her on the court, the backlash won't stay inside WNBA circles. It'll be national. It'll be cultural. And it'll be loud. That's why this isn't just about one player getting calls. It's about the league realizing that the game has changed and deciding whether it's ready to operate under those new rules. Because once corporate power enters the equation, pretending this is just basketball is no longer an option. This is the part Stephen A. Smith never backed away from, even when it made people uncomfortable. Because according to Stephen A. Smith, there's another layer to this tension that doesn't show up on box scores or balance sheets. It lives in perception, in history, in identity, and whether people admit it publicly or not, it's been shaping reactions from the very beginning. Smith has repeatedly argued that part of the resistance to Caitlin Clark comes from what she represents. A white player from Iowa being elevated as the face of a league that has been built, sustained, and carried for decades by black women. That contrast matters not because it defines Clark, but because it affects how her rise is received. This isn't an accusation, it's an observation about reality. According to Smith, these conversations are happening behind closed doors, even if nobody wants to touch them on camera. And when Nike put its full machine behind Clark, it didn't just amplify her star power, it amplified that discomfort. Because now the elevation isn't subtle. She's not just popular. She's prioritized. She's positioned as the future. That's where some of the resentment sharpens, not because Clark hasn't earned her success, but because it reopens old wounds about who gets marketed, who gets protected, and who gets labeled relatable versus dominant or difficult. Stephen A. is careful here. He doesn't frame this as malice. He frames it as friction, the kind that appears when economics, race, and visibility collide inside a league that's still finding its footing. And then there's the counterpoint, the one Smith leans into hardest. Business doesn't care about discomfort. Ratings don't lie. Ticket sales don't lie. Merchandise doesn't lie. Clark is putting people in seats. She's driving attention the league has never seen. And Smith argues that rejecting that reality in the name of internal harmony is self-sabotage. He's blunt about it. A rising tide really does lift all boats. Charter flights, better hotels, bigger TV deals, higher salary ceilings. None of that happens without a star who pulls the sport forward. But here's the catch. You only benefit from that tide if you accept where it's coming from. And that's why this conversation feels so volatile, because it forces the league to choose between comfort and growth, between protecting old dynamics and embracing a new one that doesn't ask for permission. Stephen A. believes the resistance isn't about Caitlin Clark, the player. It's about Caitlin Clark, the symbol. And once someone becomes a symbol, the reaction is never just about basketball anymore. Which brings us to the final shift, the moment where this stopped being a league story and became a culture story that the WNBA can't contain on its own. This is the point where the conversation stops being theoretical and starts feeling irreversible. Because once Caitlin Clark crossed into lifestyle territory, the rules quietly changed. Not just for her, for the entire ecosystem around her. The upcoming signature shoe isn't being treated like a normal WNBA release. Reports and industry chatter suggest it's being built for scale, not just basketball fans, not just young girls who hoop, but people who may never watch a single game and still want the product. That's the Jordan model, that's the Tiger Woods model, and that's the comparison analysts keep circling back to. When a logo becomes recognizable without context, the league stops being the brand. The athlete becomes it. That's why the interlocking C matters so much. It isn't tied to a team, it isn't tied to a league, it's tied to an identity. And once that happens, leverage flips. The player doesn't need the platform as much as the platform needs the player. According to industry observers, this is where the WNBA finds itself in a bind. Promote her too aggressively, and you risk alienating the locker room. Treat her like everyone else, and you risk leaving massive money on the table. There's no clean solution once a star reaches this level. And the pressure isn't slowing down. Upcoming TV rights negotiations are already being viewed through the Clark lens. Networks want ratings guarantees, sponsors want faces, advertisers want cultural relevance, and right now, she checks every box. If she disappeared tomorrow, the valuation conversation would look very different, and that reality isn't lost on anyone involved. This is why some analysts say the next season won't just be competitive, it'll be political. Every foul call, every highlight, every promotional decision will be scrutinized for intent. Fair or not, that comes with the territory when one player carries this much gravity. And here's the part that makes people uneasy. Once a league becomes dependent on a single figure, it loses the ability to pretend everyone is equal in influence. That doesn't mean others aren't talented. It means the market has spoken. And markets don't care about tradition. They don't care about hierarchy. They care about demand. Caitlin Clark didn't ask to become bigger than the league. But the moment corporate America decided she was indispensable, that outcome became inevitable. And now the only real question left isn't whether the WNBA can manage her stardom. It's whether the league is ready to live in a world where she no longer needs managing at all. At this point, there's no walking this back. What Stephen A. Smith did wasn't start a controversy, he confirmed one. He said out loud what had been quietly shaping the last 2 years of women's basketball, and once it was said, the entire dynamic shifted. Because this was never just about a rookie being popular. It was about power, about money, about who gets to define the future of the sport. Caitlin Clark didn't force the league into this position. The market did, fans did, ratings did, corporate America did. And when Nike went all in, they removed any illusion that this was still a league-controlled narrative. That's the uncomfortable truth. The WNBA tried to manage the moment, to balance egos, to protect internal harmony, to slow the rise just enough to keep everyone comfortable. But comfort doesn't drive growth, demand does, and demand doesn't wait for consensus. Stephen A's warning is simple but brutal. You can't suppress your biggest asset and expect to thrive. You either embrace the anomaly or you get exposed by it. And the league is now living in the consequences of hesitating too long. This doesn't mean the resentment disappears. If anything, it may intensify. Hard fouls, cold shoulders, political decisions, all of that becomes harder to contain when one player is financially bigger than the system around her. But pretending that tension doesn't exist only makes it more volatile. The irony is this: Caitlin Clark might end up doing more for the league by forcing these uncomfortable conversations than by winning any single game. She's exposing where the power really lies, who benefits from it, and who's still adjusting to the reality of modern sports economics. Because once a player reaches this level, the league doesn't set the terms anymore. Sponsors do. Networks do. The audience does. And now the WNBA is standing at a crossroads. They can either align themselves with the reality Stephen A. just confirmed, or keep fighting a wave that's already past the breaking point. One path leads to growth, money, and global relevance. The other leads to resentment, resistance, and missed opportunity. The choice might feel complicated, but the market has already made its decision. And whether the league likes it or not, the Caitlin Clark era isn't coming. It's already here.